You recently spoke at the annual meeting about the Richmond and the Margaret. You've been doing some work for quite some time. And I thought this would be a great opportunity to share with our audience the results of your research and the nexus of what you presented at the meeting, which would be so interesting to our listeners on Huguenot history.
Sure, yeah.
So we begin with our title of your talk, which was The Richmond and the Margaret, the Passengers and What Became of Them. And you're going to cover the settlement, the voyage, the arrival, and the passengers. And with that, get us going here.
Okay. Well, before I introduce you to some of the Huguenots who arrived in Carolina on the Richmond in 1680 and in 1685 on the Margaret, as I want to set the stage for you with first a brief overview of the first English settlement here, then a look at what early voyages were like as our ancestors crossed the Atlantic, and then what they found upon their arrival. So I'm going to tell you what new and interesting things I found while researching, and I'll introduce a few of the passengers. We can't possibly cover all of them in this one podcast, but I have made sketches of all of them, which will be posted on our website in the coming weeks and months. I especially want to thank the staff of the Society who encouraged me while I researched. I'm actually trying to download everything I have in my brain, and they're pretty good at keeping me on track.
We're trying, you're doing just fine without.
And then a special thanks to Elizabeth Gay, because she worked her magic with the slides in the presentation, and she also suggested how to turn my original much longer talk into something shorter. And also, you need to realize that this is an ongoing research project. There's still a lot more to be discovered, and there are lots of documents yet to be read and evaluated. And we love to have your help.
Exactly. I think that's what's always important when we start down these roads together is every day we learn something.
Right.
So if listeners know something we don't know, please share it with us. Or if it provokes an inquiry, we're happy to hear from you because we're in a constant state of studying.
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
So where we actually gave this talk to begin with was at Charlestown Landing, which was the site of the first English settlement in Carolina. And Carolina, as most of you probably know, was given to 8 lords proprietors by King Charles of England. When the first English settlers arrived here in April of 1670, they were encouraged by the local Indians to settle at Charlestown Landing on the south bank of the Ashley River. It's about 3 miles up from the harbor. And that's exactly what they did, as shown in this plat drawn by John Culpeper in August of 1671. A year later, Culpeper drew another plat known as the Grand Model, showing their proposed port town at Oyster Point, a few miles downstream between the Ashley and Cooper rivers. In 1680, that site was declared the official town and was named Charlestown by the Lords proprietors, although it was usually referred to as Oyster Point for many years. As you can see from the Grand Model, the site was riddled with creeks and marshes, which were filled in over the years, which still wreak havoc in storms and high tides.
And Cheves, how does this model drawing here relate to the plats you studied, where we've got the little boxes indicating? Is it the same era?
It's the same time period. Yeah, what Susan Bates and I did was go through the early proprietary records, several volumes, and figured out where the different people had settled on the town in Charlestown on Oyster Point. And the one of the books would give the lot number, and so that corresponds in pretty much to what the lot numbers are on this map.
Okay.
And some of them are different, and of course more lots were added, and these were mostly half-acre lots, and then they would be divided into quarter acres and smaller as people sold them.
Well, it's so interesting to see Water Street really reached
really
far.
Yeah,
It went much farther than Meeting Street.
Well, and there's in I think it was late 1700s. There's a book that talks about there being a pond behind where the post office is now on the corner of Meeting and Broad Street. So it went way up.
And it almost seems like it crosses Meeting and heads towards Price's Alley.
Yeah,
a little bit.
I mean, it was low land.
Yeah.
It was, and fill. I mean, they started filling the land almost as soon as they moved here with just junk, and then eventually were able to walk across it and then filled it some more and were able to declare lots.
And some of these same areas flood to
They
this
still
day.
flood today,
Because when
yeah.
you're on water, you're on
You're on
water. Yeah.
water, right, yeah.
Interesting. Thank you.
Yeah. So the stage is now set, and we'll leave it with a portrait of Anthony Ashley Cooper, Lord Shaftesbury, whose names were given to the two rivers which flow into Charleston Harbor, and where, according to my father, they form the Atlantic Ocean.
That's an old joke
That's
here
an
in
old joke,
Charleston.
right?
Yeah.
Of course, to get here, our immigrant ancestors had to cross that ocean. The first known group of Huguenots arrived on the 29th of April, 1680, and they were men, women, and children who fled religious persecution in France. Our ancestors were lucky, and most made it to England, where they learned about Carolina. After that initial arrival, the colony saw the arrival of many more French refugees, now most often called Huguenots. Except for the passenger list for the 1670 arrivals in Charlestown, there are no known ships passengers lists for Carolina other than those for the Richmond and the Margaret. So the Richmond, which brought the first group of Huguenots in 1680, was an English ship known as a man of war. They were usually three-masted galleons about 60 meters long with 3 gun decks, and it would have carried from 50 to 100 guns, several on the bow and stern, and the rest on the 2 broadsides. The crew and military would have been on the upper decks, and the Huguenots were probably squeezed in below in dark and uncomfortable spaces. 5 years later, more Huguenots arrived on the Margaret. It was known as a pink, which was a smaller flat-bottom boat often used to carry cargo. It was probably square-rigged with a shallow draft and carried 20 to 30 crew members. As on the Richmond, passengers would have been below the main deck in the dark cargo holds. There were probably about 60 or 70 passengers on the Richmond, in addition to up to 300 crew and military men, and about 106 on the Margaret. But before we get to the passengers, I want to point out a few things about the voyages they undertook to get here. And you can see in this picture that it's not a very exciting space to be in with 60 or 70 people most of whom you don't know.
You almost can't imagine
No, I
it
mean,
today.
just incredible.
Yeah, I mean, that they even made it here is
Right.
remarkable.
And they did often, I mean, they could go up above on the decks if they were allowed to, but
Yeah.
still to be shut down in there, you can only imagine.
Yeah.
An entry in the logbook of the Richmond reads, quote, 1679, December the 19th, Friday. This morning about 5 o'clock came aboard some of the French passengers that were to go to Carolina with us. 6 days later, on Christmas Day, they set sail from Purfleet, but they had to anchor and wait due to bad weather. And then almost 2 months later, the log shows they were abreast Dover on February 13th. And they anchored 2 days later in Plymouth Sound to take on water and provisions, but quote, there was none ready for us. So they didn't, this was an especially long voyage, and they were in the ship most of the time. And we may have lost some passengers that way or gained some new ones.
And they may have been there a while since the provisions weren't ready.
Right.
So their departure date was surely not this date.
Probably not.
Because they needed to get provisions.
right.
Yeah, interesting.
And then there are no descriptions of the actual voyages across the Atlantic by either the Richmond or the Margaret, but a letter written from Carolina in 1686 by Jacques Boyd of Bordeaux describes the frightful weather his group endured, as well as an attempted mutiny. He wrote, for several days, the captain had reduced us to 1 bottle of water a day and no more beer. He gave no more bread than a biscuit and a half a day, most of the time spoiled, even though we had brought good provisions. We preferred to suffer a little rather than to come to angry extremes, but he then decided to burn some tar between the 2 bridges and to tightly close all the hatches under pretext of clearing the air. Someone forced a small hatch and threw themselves on several sailors and the captain, and would have thrown them in the sea if some of us had not calmed the disorder. The captain next wanted to tie a Swiss person who had hit him to the mast. It was then that they talked of taking up arms. After this affair was squelched, we held ourselves always on guard, and the captain was much nicer than he had been.
It almost sounds like he's trying to take the passenger fare and then just get rid of the
Just get rid of the
passengers.
passengers, yeah, smoke them out or
Yeah.
something.
Wow. Talk about being in jeopardy.
Yeah.
1686. Good night.
The Richmond log ends with this entry, 1680, April the 30th, Friday. This day we landed most of our passengers' goods at Oyster Point in Carolina. If you remember a few minutes ago, I said the ship had arrived on the 29th, and researchers showed that it probably did arrive at least one day before the passengers' belongings were offloaded. And that was more than 4 months after they had embarked from England. When they finally disembarked in Carolina, the passengers, accustomed to the fields and open vistas of France and England, found instead forests of longleaf pines and oaks, swamps and bogs, alligators, skunks, and rattlesnakes. There was very little cleared land, and as one writer commented, no walled town, surprising to the newly arrived refugees because European towns were usually walled. And it surprised me too, but it corroborates what Susan Bates and I found when we abstracted the Charlestown lotted measurements. There were no defensive walls in Charlestown until at least 30 years after the first European immigrants arrived. And it was Huguenots who helped design and build those defenses.
So let's recap these dates
Yeah.
just quickly here because we're moving through so much content. It's about 1685. This letter is written,
Right.
no walled town. Some description is provided, so we know there's a
Yeah.
town.
Yeah.
Okay, and then you're saying it's 30 years probably until we see this
Well,
fully.
30 years from when the town, from, yeah, about
1670.
60, it was about 1705 to 1707 when there was a threat of pirates
Okay,
and Spaniards and Indians coming up from Florida. And so that was when they decided to start really building a wall. They had, at some point, they did have, I think in 1694, the proprietors told settlers that had owned lots along the harbor in Charleston that they could build a small wall to keep out the sea from encroaching, because they had a common ground along the waterfront, and they could, but they allowed them to put a small wall up. And Nick Butler at the South Carolina room at the Charleston Public Library has done a whole research and paper on the wall, and he gave us the talk of the society a couple of years ago.
oh, great, so people
So
could go
we
listen to
can go
that.
look at that. Yeah.
Excellent, okay, moving on.
All right, so then we're talking about 1686, and this is a map of the town that was drawn by Jacques Boyd's brother Jean. And it shows two forts where the arrows are, one at the head of Broad Street and one on the harbor near Water Street, and a trench stretching between the two. In addition to being the first map of Charlestown, which by the way came to us through the help of society member Sam Watson and his friends in Aberdeen, Scotland, where the map and letter were found. The letter also includes images of some of the trees and flowers Boyd saw after their arrival. The letter and the map and drawings are in transactions number 110, which is available on our website. So who were these men, women, and children who risked the dangers of escape and then a 2 to 4 month sea voyage to a strange land? Many with little or no money, some with skills in weaving, wine, and oil making, all having left their homeland, relatives and friends with no assurance of their future. We don't have time to go through all of them, but I do want to share with you a few of the interesting things I learned, as well as one very exciting bit of information. So listen for the Garrard 14, for several shipboard romances, for a very important date, and for relationships between passengers on the two ships. As I noticed earlier, there are two lists of the passengers on the Richmond. This one made in October and a second list made in November. And those are the two lists that you see on the screen right now. My rough estimate is that there were between 50 to 70 Huguenots on the Richmond, about 15 or 16 family groups who actually came and stayed in Carolina, but the numbers are very difficult to pin down. There were at least 7 people not named on either list whom we know arrived on the Richmond, and they could have been among the unnamed passengers who were enumerated. So it got very confusing. And for those of you interested in statistics, and I don't do well with numbers, so check mine. There are 32 surnames connected to the Richmond, some on the passenger lists and others found in warrants or other documents. Of those 32 surnames, 22 were found in the Carolina records at some point, and 10 never appear in the Carolina records at all. Of the 22 found here, 14 left descendants in the colony, and of those, only 2 surnames are still extant. So an example of the problems I found is we can look at Jean Lariche, whose name is on both lists. In October of 1679, he was listed as bringing 2 unnamed women with him. On the November list, there were 4 people with him, and we learned that he was, quote, from the Palatinate. He made his mark, so he probably may not have been able to read and write. But I didn't find any records for Jean or John Lariche in Carolina. Neither did Dr. St. Julian Childs or Martha Burns, whose articles on the Richmond are in Transactions and also available on our website.
Mhm.
I also found entries which might be for him in the records of the French churches in England. Was he Jean Lariche, who married Anne Fairmont and whose 2 children were born in London and baptized there, Susanna in 1677 and Jean in 1679, just 8 months before the Richmond set sail? Did the parents board the ship with their 2 babies? Did they die en route or after their arrival? Or did they decide not to make the voyage at all and stayed in England, where there are later records for a man named Jean Lariche? I don't know, but I did find the name Susanna Lariche in the Carolina records. She married George Juin and left children whose descendants have joined this society. Was she the lone survivor of Jean Lariche on the Richmond list, or was she someone else? We may never know for sure. And we may never know if there was a connection between Jean Lariche on the Richmond and Pierre Lariche, who was part of the French settlement in New Bordeaux, South Carolina in 1765. So, as so often happens, research on one subject leads to more questions and the need for more research.
So passenger lists aren't always an indication the passengers on the ship?
It just depends, because as we saw with the Richmond leaving England, they were 2 months late leaving. People might have gotten off and said, forget it, I'm not going. The latest list we had was from November, when they supposedly set sail in December. So they could have added passengers, they could have lost them, somebody could have died, they could have had a baby.
So even between London and departure, when you were showing the
It
ship,
could
you
change.
could get off and not get back on, you could have passed
I
away,
think,
and they wouldn't amend the starting list.
no,
It
if
just,
we,
that's
or
the
if they did,
list.
we don't have another list.
We don't have another
You know, we haven't found another list. I'm
Just to help
always thinking,
researchers think,
Yeah,
don't assume a list means
that's all, only people who are on
everything.
there. Right.
Yeah,
Yeah, you have to
gotcha.
look at it. And as the research showed, and will show even more when we start putting all the names on, I didn't find stuff for some of the people.
Right.
And so, does that mean they died? Does it mean they didn't come to Carolina? Did they get off the ship and stay in England? And some of them I did find in England, or I found them in New York. So maybe they came here, they got off the boat and said, I'm not staying in this place, and they went up to New York. We went back to the West Indies. Some of them we just haven't been able to
You just
find.
you just don't know everything.
We don't
You
know everything, and
Yeah.
hopefully somebody will
So
find
Jean
them.
Lariche, a good example
Yeah,
of what could or could not
What?
come to pass.
right.
Yeah.
I was able to find out more about some of the other passengers on the Richmond list, some who came and stayed, some who came and left, and others who may have never left England. Oh, you did. And there are, of course, some for whom I found no information. I placed the names in the following categories: surnames on one or both lists for whom there are records in Carolina.
So let's pause there. This first chart, I see Lariche.
Right.
So put some context around that based on what we just said.
So I found records in Carolina for those surnames. Maybe not, like for Lariche, I never found Jean Lariche, but I found Suzanne Lariche.
Gotcha. Okay.
Um,
That's what I think helps.
right.
So we
And
see
if
it.
you look at Tibu was here. There's a letter that Tibu wrote, and he was up in Goose Creek in that area. But then the whole family left and they went to New York, and then they came back here, and then they ended up in the West Indies. And we don't have anybody who joined the society on Tibu, but I think there are descendants in the West Indies, but
Oh,
we haven't ever.
so as we
done
go
research.
forward, you mentioned at the beginning, you'll be doing some profiles. This
Right.
is sort of what you'll be getting into.
Some of these people.
Is some of
yeah,
these
Yeah, and
people,
all
okay.
of the people all the names here, I have a sketch on them. it may just say, I didn't find anything about them.
Right.
Thibault goes into great length about what his family did. And you can see the two names on here that we still, Gerard and Varin, which is now Varine, are the only two that I know of that have descendants that still have the same surnames, because the other lines, as we'll talk about, daughtered out.
Okay.
Okay, so the
Thank you.
first list is those for whom there are records in Carolina on both, one or both lists. And then the second grouping is surnames that aren't on either list, but were known to have been on the Richmond. So we know those people were on, they came over here on the Richmond, but they were not on the passenger list. They could have been, there were two unnamed men, and that could have been who they were. And we know that some of them were servants for people from the warrants, but they never, their names were not on the Richmond list. And then there are the people who may have arrived and left with no references in Carolina until much later. And these are 4 surnames which I found in the Carolina records, but not until most, I think they were all after 1700. So I don't know whether they were here being very quiet and
Right.
never got in the records, or had children and they died and their children, I don't, we have to figure that out if we can. And then the last name, well, not the
Category.
for the category
Yeah.
is there's no reference in the Carolina Richmond, in the Carolina records at all for these names. And I will say that I think, I can't remember what I said about the de Pomar. I don't think I found any, I did find a reference to that name in the Quarto, but not to the given name. So as far as I know, he never came here.
And for those who don't know, what's the Quarto?
The Quarto are the records of the French churches in England that the Huguenot Society of Great Britain and Ireland has, and we have copies here that we can look at. But then there are 3 people with possible connections to the Richmond: Henry Blanchard, Marguerite Petit, and James Phillips. And I found out Robert the servant is actually on one of the other, or should be on one of the other lists, because I did find him in a warrant. So did you recognize any names? As far as I can tell, as I said, Gerard and Varin are still in use, but none of the others are. They daughtered out, meaning the surnames are no longer extant, but the lineages are still valid. Since I'm giving the talk and had to choose which surnames to discuss, I decided to tell you about one of my maternal ancestors who evidently arrived in Carolina alone as a servant of Jacob Gerard. My ancestor's parents had been members of the French church in Paris, and in 1674, his father was admitted to the Weavers' Company in London as a foreign journeyman. His name does not appear on either passenger list.
What does that mean? Weavers Company and Journeyman, for those who don't know.
There was that was a company in London, a
Mhm.
guild sort of the weavers, and in order to be able to weave and make a living that way in England, you had to be a member of it.
Oh.
And you had to be accepted, and so he was accepted as a journeyman, which I'm not exactly sure, or foreign journeyman, I'm not exactly sure what that means, whether he was just a day worker or whether he was actually a member of it.
And we're familiar with the guild terms in the
Yeah.
colonies, they had
Right.
guilds.
Yeah.
And you had to be a member to do the profession.
Right,
So almost like a saying you're certified.
right.
Kind of a thing, yeah.
And so there are Huguenot names on those lists, but
Mhm.
going through them, you just have to see what it says about each person if he's on there.
Mhm.
So I did find his father on there. And as I said, all right, Salomon's name is not on either passenger list, but he was probably one of the 14 unnamed passengers listed with Jacob Gerard. And then he was listed by name in a 1681 warrant for land that was given to Gerard. By 1697, Bremer had married a woman named Marie Sauvager. And I found that she and Françoise Sauvager, both from La Rochelle and probably sisters, had made their reconnaissance in London in 1687. And making their reconnaissance meant that they admitted that they had gone to a Catholic church or taken mass in France, probably for their own safety before they were able to get out of the country. And they had to admit they did that, and then they were welcomed into the French churches in London.
And that's not an uncommon thing to see.
No,
You shouldn't find it shocking
Yeah,
if you're
no.
researching for the first time. because they had to get out of France.
They had, yeah,
Yeah.
and then the other thing you'll find as sort of a side note in the French records, the churches in England, the records of the French churches in England, is people who made their témoignage, which was their witness. And they are usually on a list and then followed by the name of somebody who sort of vouched for them. That they knew this person in France, that he was an okay Protestant and, or she was, and they could, become members of the
It's
church. and-
legitimizing
Yeah,
your
legitimizing
claim.
your claim to being a
Yeah.
Protestant, yeah.
Interesting.
So anyway, we have these two sisters probably. They made their reconnaissance in 1687, but we don't have any reference. I didn't find anything else for Françoise, and I don't know when Marie arrived in Carolina. We don't know when she married Bremer, but they had married by 1697. And they had two children, at least, Jacques and Marie. We know they lived in Orange Quarter and that they had done well since their arrival. When he died in 1721, Salomon Bremer's will listed 2,310 acres of land and 5 slaves. Both of his children married and had issue, but the surname Bremer appears to have eventually disappeared. Salomon Bremer and Marie Sauvager have been used as ancestors, and all of the lineages that we have come through their daughter Marie, who married into the Cheves family, who were also Huguenots. So that gives any descendant of theirs at least 4 Huguenot ancestors, the 2 women and the 2 men,
Mhm.
husband and wife. One passenger we know a lot about is Abraham Fleury de la Plaine from Tours, France. He also was not named on either passenger list, but he was named in a warrant as having arrived in April of 1680 with servants whose names were not given, but who must be added to the number of passengers. He also claimed arrival rights for 6 other people, 4 of whom were listed on the passenger list, and 2 who arrived later that year. So I don't know what was going on here, why his name, he may have been the Mr. or friend of somebody, but this is why it was so hard to figure out exactly how many people were on the ship. How
Yeah,
many
because he's
Huguenots.
claiming 6,
He's
but they
claiming,
come at different times.
came-
4
yeah,
come at first
yeah.
and 2 later in the year.
2 were Blanchard and the other one who were on that list was
Uh-huh.
Marguerite Petit, and they arrived later. I figured out it's probably likely that his sister Madeline and his brother Isaac came with him, as well as his daughter Marianne, who married Jacques de Gay Jr. soon after 1685. After de Gay's death 10 years later, she married Pierre Bacot, who was also from Tours. Fleury also claimed arrival rights for Henry Blanchard and James Phillips, who arrived in September and October of 1680, respectively. And there was a thought, Dr. Childs thought that they were part of a second contingent of the Richmond group. There's a second ship that was mentioned in some records, but we haven't found any proof of this, and there are no further records for either Blanchard or Phillips in the records of Carolina. So Abraham Fleury was 79 years of age when he wrote his will in 1721. He left his 830-acre plantation on Goose Creek to his brother Isaac, with reversions to his granddaughter Marianne Duguay and her husband Stephen Fitch. Abraham Fleury's land is important because it appears to have been used as a staging ground for new Huguenot arrivals in Carolina. Another reason for its importance is 1 acre of land in the tract, which is shown on this plat drawn by Joseph Purcell in about 1785. It's difficult to read, but it shows, quote, the remains of a French church on Fleury's land, and there are later references to the remnants of a graveyard on that acre. The tract passed through several hands, and in 1858 was purchased by Lamb Stevens, a free person of color who also owned most of the nearby Porcher land. Fleury's tract was later owned by the Charleston Orphanage Society. Then in 1908, 1 acre of the original tract was bought by Henry Augustus Middleton Smith. A year later, he wrote the society, quote, I have acquired the site of the old French church in St. James Goose Creek. This was one of the earliest churches established in the country outside of Charlestown. I desire to transfer the old church site and graveyard, in all about an acre, to the society, which would appear to be its most appropriate owner and custodian. In 1910, the annual meeting of this society was held at the Goose Creek Cross site. At that time, it was announced that, quote, the heavy granite cross of rustic finish upon a block with concave sides has the inscriptions, site of the ancient and extinct French church of Goose Creek, with its surrounding burying ground, established about 1694 by French Protestants on the front and erected AD 1910 by the Huguenot Society of South Carolina on this God's acre, donated to the Society in Trust 8th July 1909 on the back. This monument is set in the center of the plot, and a granite post marks each of the four corners of the acre. It constitutes a part of the old De La Plaine settlement.
And in present day, it's near Charleston Southern University, sort of.
Yeah, sort of.
I-26 area. So
Yeah.
folks wondering, head of the Goose Creek up there,
Right.
yes, where it would be. And it's
Yeah,
in good condition and we take good care of it.
it is. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's on a very wooded site now, not
Mhm.
as in the picture.
Yeah.
Did you notice the discrepancy in the date of 1694 with what the records found since that was written show? The French settlement at Goose Creek actually began in 1680 and was well established by 1694 and probably had a church building before that date. It was a small settlement and did not last as long as the ones at Orange Quarter and French Santee. So now we move to another Richmond passenger who was Jacques Varin of Rouen, France. When Louis Thibault, also a Richmond passenger and a neighbor of Abraham Fleury, wrote to friends in London in 1683, he noted, quote, "Mr. Varin is making lots of money at his trade." Varin, his wife Suzanne Horry of Neuchâtel, Switzerland, baptized at least 3 children, Suzanne, Isaac, and Jean-Jacques, in London by 1676. Attending the baptisms were Marguerite Lemonteux, widow of Jacques Poitevin, and her daughter Elizabeth d'Amberbeau, her daughter by her first husband, whom you will hear more about when we get to the passengers on the Margaret. To confuse my search even more, there was another Jacques Varin in London who baptized 4 daughters during the same period. So it's often very hard to tell who we're talking about. That's why the names of the witnesses and other people at the services are important to look at. Jacques Varin of Carolina was listed on the October Richmond list as having 1 man, 1 woman, and 1 child in his group. The November list shows a group of 2, so the children may have died prior to that. Although when he got here, Varin claimed arrival rights for himself, his wife, and a son. He died in 1688, and there are 2 undated fragments of his will, one written in French and the other in English. And they don't really say the same thing. They don't say much. His wife's name was given as Susan and his eldest son as Jacob. No daughter was mentioned. In 1697, Susanna Horry's name was entered on the list of French who wanted to be naturalized, with her children Suzanne and Jacob, both born in Carolina. So does this mean that the son claimed in the warrant had died, or is he the Jeremiah Varin, also found in the Carolina records, possibly a son by a first wife who died?
So these 3 children may not, we started with Suzanne, Isaac, and Jean-Jacques. They may not have made it here at all.
No, those are the 3 that were on the list in 1697 with Suzanne Horry.
Okay.
Jacques had died. We know, we'll find later, that Suzanne, the child, lived. We don't know what happened to Isaac and Jean-Jacques.
Okay.
And then there's another man named Jeremiah Varin that we don't know at all who he's related to. And there may be records in France. There may be more in England, but we haven't found them. So by the time her husband Jacques Varin's estate was settled in 1710, Suzanne Horry Varin was the wife of Élie Prelot. And her daughter, Suzanne Varin, who was that child, had married Joel Poinsett. No references to Jacob Varin have been found in the Carolina records. So we don't know a lot about some of the family.
Right.
I'll end my discussion of the Richmond passengers with Jacob Garrard, one of the 2 undertakers or organizers of the voyage. Both he and Rene Petit were granted 4,000 acres rent-free by the Lord's proprietors for transporting so many settlers. We know almost nothing about Petit, but Garrard from Dieppe in Normandy was listed as having a group of 14 people with him. Warrants and other documents indicate that his wife Marguerite and their 6 children were all on board, in addition to the servants named in his 1681 warrant, one of whom was my ancestor Bremer.
Who you discussed earlier.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One of the aha moments came when I was able to identify all of the 14 people listed with Jacob Garrard from warrants and other records, his family of 6 and his 6 servants. Pierre and Marguerite Garrard's eldest child, Pierre Jacob Garrard, was listed separately on both lists with 2 people in his group. He obtained a patent for a rice husking machine and was named a collector of the port of Charlestown. Both Pierre Jacob Garrard and his father had several lots in Charlestown and witnessed numerous wills and deeds, and the apprenticeship paper for Garrard's son Isaac was also found. Research on other family members is ongoing. After the arrival of the Richmond, the Lord's proprietors requested that newly arriving groups of foreigners be settled together instead of being allowed to take up land wherever they wanted to. In 1685, a lot of the passengers on the Margaret settled on or near what became known as Orange Quarter. That's the Orange, appropriate, I guess.
Near today's Saint Thomas Saint Denis
yeah.
Church, which is in present day Canehoy.
Canehoy, yeah.
In case people are curious to take a drive.
Right.
You can't see it. It's open.
On July 15th, 1685, a list of 115 passengers to embark on the Margaret, Pink of London, Ralph Crowe commander, was entered in the calendar of state papers in London. I'm just going to give you an overview. I'm not going to go into every single one.
All 115 today? No.
Not those.
We'll get to that when
We'll
we
get to
can.
that eventually.
Yeah.
I do have a sketch for each of them. So of those 115 passengers, 106 were, quote, bound for Carolina. The other 8 were going to Holland and Ireland. And I haven't quite figured that out because I don't know where the ship left, I don't think. And so I don't know how, were they going to go by Holland and drop them off? And I don't know what was going on
Interesting
there.
route.
I
You went
know. But
Holland to
normally-
Ireland.
Yeah, normally they went south and
Mhm.
across. So I don't know what was going on there.
And they depart from London? Is that where they're departing from?
I think so.
Okay.
I don't know if we
You
have
said
that.
state papers in
Yeah,
London.
Pink of London.
So I
yeah.
assume.
It said it's
Okay.
called the Pink of London, so they would have come
Mhm.
out the same way the
The
Richmond
Richmond did.
did, but
yeah.
then I don't know.
Right.
I don't know how things worked. But anyway, there were 106 that were bound for Carolina. And the Carolina bound passengers included about 43 family groups, some with only one person in them. There were 12 English families and 31 French families. No slaves were listed, but there were at least 3 on board. Because I found that out from research. I'll talk about that in a minute.
Okay.
I estimate that about 60 to 70 of the passengers were French. As with the Richmond, it's very difficult to come up with a definite number. Nothing is known about how the group was organized or if any one person was in charge. The only hint may be that one of my paternal ancestors, Antoine Bonneau, was given a warrant for 3,000 acres of rent-free land 2 months after his arrival in Carolina. This usually indicated that the person had brought in a large group of settlers, but I haven't found anything to corroborate that for Bonneau.
And he's on them.
He's
ship.
on the ships, he's
Yeah.
on the ship's list, yeah. with
On the
his family,
Margaret.
Yeah. As with the Richmond list, I did not find any records in Carolina or other colonies for some of the passengers. Some may not have made the trip, some may have boarded the Margaret and then died en voyage. Some may have arrived here and then left, where they died before any record of them in Carolina was made. But some interesting things did turn up. It was actually kind of fun to connect them all, or try to connect them. A few of the passengers on the Margaret had connections with some of the passengers on the Richmond. There were a number of marriages between men and women who probably did not know each other before the voyage. So shipboard romances, maybe despite or perhaps because of close quarters and the lack of privacy. How otherwise explain the marriage between a French girl from northern France and a boy from Languedoc in the south? There are still unanswered questions about a few of the passengers, but some family relationships can now be explained or added to. But for me, the most exciting find was completely random. After I finished researching the French passengers, I decided I needed to do a little bit of research on the English names just in case they were connected in some way. And that turned out to be a very good idea. Almost immediately, I found a warrant to Thomas Bolton for his arrival and the arrival of his wife Anne, Thomas Bolton Jr., and Martin, Mariah, and Tom, Negroes, quote, who arrived the 5th of September, 1685. This indicates several things. First, there were more passengers on board than the passenger list shows, since the passenger list only has the names of Ann Bolton and her daughter Sarah. No mention of Thomas Sr. or Jr., and no mention of Martin, Mariah, and Tom. Secondly, it shows that there were at least 3 slaves on board. And thirdly, but most importantly for us, I think it gives the arrival date of the Margaret. We know from the entry I quoted a few minutes ago that the ship sailed on or about the 15th of July, 1685. And I submit that we now know that she arrived in Charlestown on the 5th of September, a trip of less than 2 months, much shorter than the voyage of the Richmond. And that means we now have another date to celebrate.
So around Labor Day, we'll be at 340 years
Right,
since the Margaret,
Since
and
the
today
Margaret.
it's 345
right.
since the Richmond.
So it's kind of exciting.
Very exciting.
Yeah. I think we need to acknowledge those dates and celebrate them every year.
Absolutely.
And so here are the passengers, quote, bound for Carolina on the Margaret, broken into 3 groups. The first is a list of the English passengers, and I do have sketches for these, not in depth, but sketches.
Mhm.
And then the second is a list of the French passengers on the Margaret for whom no references in Carolina were found. And I know they were French, and I did find out something about some of them I didn't find anything about. And the last list is a list of the French passengers on the Margaret for whom references were found.
And we're familiar with like Nicholas de Longmar.
Right.
He's got the register we've
Yeah.
studied many times.
And Pierre.
Poinsett, yeah.
So there are a number of, and Poitevin we know.
Mhm.
And so they're familiar, and there are some unfamiliar names.
Yeah, and of course the Bonos. you
Yeah,
know.
and I didn't do a thing I haven't figured out, I should go through, but whose names are still extant.
Right.
For example, Bremer, I don't think there are any more Bremers left, but they're still ancestors.
And we recently touched on Daniel Eugee's line with the Lafayette celebrations.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
interesting.
So, yeah. And so another aha moment came as I was researching the French families. I noticed that there were connections between a number of them. And there were also connections back to one of the organizers of the Richmond voyage and to a family on the Richmond. The Richmond connections jumped out at me when I researched Jacques Lassalle, who was born in Normandy. He was the son of Adam Lassalle and Anne Gerard, a relative of Jacob Gerard, the organizer of the Richmond voyage, who brought his whole family to Carolina. Jacques Lassalle and his wife, Elizabeth d'Amberbeau, received permission from the French Church of London to marry, quote, in the English church in 1676. They had no children, but were godparents to numerous children of both friends and relatives in the ensuing years while still in London. In addition to the Gerard connection, Elizabeth d'Amberbeau's mother, Marguerite, was godmother to Suzanne Varin, daughter of Jacques Varin, and Suzanne Horry, who had arrived in Carolina on the Richmond, and Elizabeth herself was godmother to their son Isaac. And just to make things even more confusing, there was another Jacques Lassalle in London at the same time, or there may have been 2 more. The records are a bit confusing and need to be sorted.
And this is the same Jacques Varin and Suzanne Horry you spoke about earlier.
Yeah.
They had those 3 children. We weren't sure what became of Isaac,
Right,
but we at least know we had a godmother
right.
on the Margaret.
On the Margaret.
Oh, that is
Yeah.
interesting. How it
5
comes
years
together.
later, the godmother comes over, yeah. And I'm sure there are other connections that we haven't made yet. But,
Yeah.
Another connection with Lassalle showed up with Margaret passenger Isaac Formey, who was born in London in 1674. Isaac was 3 when Jacques Lassalle stood as a witness at Isaac's brother Adam Formey's baptism in London. When Isaac was 9, he was listed on the passenger list of the Margaret as a servant of Jacques Lassalle. I didn't find any other records for young Isaac, and I hope he returned to England with his godmother's mother, Marguerite, when she returned to England. Marguerite Le Motto d'Amberbeau had married as her second husband, Jacques Poitevin, and there may be a connection to Antoine Poitevin of Orange Quarter in Carolina, but I haven't gone there yet, so I'm not sure.
Makes sense.
I
though.
get mixed up
Right.
easily.
Well, and it's a lot of
Similar,
yeah.
right. Another passenger on the Margaret arrived in Carolina as a widower with 2 sons. Nicholas de Longmar was a watchmaker. After his wife, Anne Leroy, died, he and his sons, Nicholas and Jacob, escaped to London, where he bought 100 acres of land in Carolina, on June 23rd, 1685. I haven't figured out that yet either, because he would get land coming over here, but he definitely bought land. The
Okay,
next month, he and his son's names were on the passenger list of the Margaret. After his arrival here, he had land in Orange Quarter surveyed early the next year and received his grant in 1689. He bought another 100 acres, which later became part of Middleburg Plantation. That tract is now part of Halidon Hill, where an old rice reserve is called Logbor, probably a local rendition of the French name de Longmar. Beginning a trend of shipboard romances, his son Nicholas de Longmar married fellow passenger Marie Bonneau, daughter of Antoine Bonneau and Catherine de Blois. After Marie's death from smallpox in 1699, Nicholas married Marie Saurier, widow of his Orange Quarter neighbor, Jean Huguenot. Nicholas Longmar II was a gold and silversmith, a silk merchant, and he also made paper money and seals for South Carolina. During the fete, after this talk, we went to the Charleston Museum on Friday and saw Longmar's account book there. And there's an article about him and the Huguenots in the next transactions that will be on our website.
and we'll be communicating with the membership over the summer, a conservation effort for this book that does need some
Oh,
conservation.
wonderful.
And Ms. McCormick at the museum has been so helpful to us in ascertaining the steps required and what's needed. So we look forward to preserving this if we can.
Super, yeah.
Conserving, I should say.
Conserving,
Yeah,
yeah.
excuse me.
Two other shipboard romances are somewhat connected. One involved Jacques Benoit, a widower whose son Jean was with him. Their arrival rights were claimed by Isaac Caillebeuf. By 1697, Jacques Benoit had married Sarah Mounier, who was on the Margaret with her parents and siblings. And marriage number 3, Caillebeuf himself married fellow passenger Rachel Fanton, who was part of her brother-in-law Daniel Garnier's group on the Margaret. The Caillebeuf family lived on what was called Caillebeuf Lane, now known as Beaton's Alley. Caillebeuf sold one of his town lots to Jean Thomas, another fellow passenger on the Margaret, who quote, was the only person that deserves the name of a physician in this place, according to Commissary Gideon Johnston, who was himself married to a Huguenot, the pastel artist Henrietta Johnston. Neither of them was a passenger on the Margaret. Rachel Fanton's sister Elizabeth and her husband Daniel Garnier were the parents of the bride in another wedding. They had arrived in Carolina with 5 children and 3 servants, all named on the passenger list. Their daughter Elizabeth Garnier was not named on the passenger list, but on August 23rd, 1692, she married Daniel Oree, who had arrived in Carolina barely 4 months earlier on the Loyal Jamaica, said to have been either a private ship or a privateer.
2 different things.
Right, which it was, often depended upon who was involved in the time period. So I don't know if she arrived on the Margaret or on another ship. Maybe she came in on the Loyal Jamaica. I don't think she was a pirate, but we don't know. That's one of several unanswered questions about these lists. Another question surfaced when I researched Daniel UG. An entry dated February 1685 in the London Register indicates that he was one of 4 men who were going to find out, quote, what was being offered for Carolina and Pennsylvania. Another note states that he and other poor French Protestants were going to Pennsylvania at or about the month of June 1685. Did UG change his plans and come to Carolina on the Margaret instead? His name is on the list, but according to his warrant, he arrived in 1686 with his family. He could have come alone at first and then returned for his family after he decided on coming to Carolina. I don't know, nor do I know how his family got here. He and Marguerite Perdriau had married in La Rochelle in 1677. Their first child was born in France a year later, and 10 years later, UG wrote from his land in French Santee, quote, at 5 o'clock in the morning, my wife was brought to bed of her 12th child, a son who was baptized and named Daniel.
12
12
children.
12 children.
That's remarkable.
I mean, yeah, it is remarkable. Yeah. We don't know how many of those children were with them in Carolina, but only 3 of the 12 survived childhood.
Oh,
Magdalene was born in Carolina about 1687, And she died here when she was 18 and, quote, lies buried in the French church in Charleston. Their eldest daughter, Marguerite, married Leory, and their son Daniel married Elizabeth Genjon, both from French Santee. And that's where we had the finale of this year's ramble on Saturday was at Hampton's Plantation, which was owned by the UG, Orry, Pinckney, and Rutledge families, and is now a state park. Daniel UG the Elder was 61 years of age when he died on Christmas Eve of 1711. His wife Marguerite Pergio died in 1717. They were buried on their land on Wamball Creek in French Santee. The obelisk marking their grave sites was later moved to the graveyard of Wamball Church, where it stands today, close to the old King's Highway. So I hope this has given you some new insights into our ancestors, a motley crew to be sure, but all interesting, and I hope even more that some of you will be inspired to continue the search for more information. This has barely scratched the surface.
So we'll come back to these surnames in posting these vignettes you've written on each one,
Right.
what you know. So if you follow our website, you'll see those coming up through the summer
Yeah,
and maybe through the end of the year. It depends on how long it takes us. But this is tremendous to build upon what was published. Transactions 93 in 1988 has the list
right.
at that time, what they knew.
And one thing about that list that I want to do, but I haven't been able to, is to go up to Columbia, because that's where it was found. I think Alex Moore found it, and look at the original list, because to see if, because this is a typescript, and you always want to go back to the original if you can, to see if there's anything that was spelled differently or got left out or whatever.
That's a good note to researchers too,
Yeah.
that no matter what you find, if you can see an original, do so.
Right, yeah, because we make mistakes.
Well, and we found things marked in margins
Yeah,
before that
yeah.
have led to
right,
discoveries that may have been overlooked prior. Footnotes,
Yep.
we've sometimes found things too, so interesting. All right, so we have gotten ourselves off to a great start here on the Richmond and the Margaret, revisiting these topics. And we appreciate so much your long year of work.
Oh, you're welcome. It was fun.
Thank
It's
you.
interesting.
Well,
Yeah.
listeners, if you have any questions, just email us and we're happy to answer them as best we can. And we look forward to future explorations.
Right, yeah,
Thanks, Cheves.
you're welcome. Thank you.